Hello. How are you all doing tonight? My name is Ken Chen, and I'm the executive director of the Asian American Writers Workshop. I've just been rolled out in a wheelbarrow to do an automated introduction, after which the very inspiring and brilliant Viet and all the other authors will actually say inspiring, moving things after you've heard my PBS Pledge Drive material. But how many of you, is this your first time to an event by either the Asian American Writers Workshop or DVAN? Well, thank you all for coming. Now you've officially joined the fan club, and you're now been inducted into our secret society. To ask another question, how many of you have ever been maybe the only Asian American person in a room, or maybe you've gone to a reading and you were the only person of color here? Well, some overlap, but I think the overlap in those hands shows why we're here. We're here to create a community, and we're here to say that all of you belong. And the Asian American Writers Workshop and DVAN are both spaces created by Asian American writers and readers for Asian American writers and readers. So we're really glad that you can all be here. One more audience participation question. I know we've been flooded with phone calls from all of you beautiful, amazing people trying to hound us down to get tickets for this event. And I know some of you flew in or came from out of town. How many of you are non-New Yorkers who came all the way here? Let's give a big hand. And those of you out-of-towners, I know maybe there's a stereotype that Asian Americans are shy, but can some of you yell out where you flew in from? California! Woo! Hamptons. Got some bougie Asian Americans, West Coasters. All right, I'm going to just say some boring things about AWW, and then we'll start with the program. So we're dedicated to the idea that Asian American stories deserve to be told. We're proud to be a co-sponsor of this event with DVAN. We have a kind of secret history that people don't know about. We were founded in 1991 in a very different age of New York, in a very different age of Asian American identity. So writers like Ed Lin and Jessica Hagedorn would hold events in the basement, and Monique Trung in the East Village. A lot of people, like more recently in the last decade, Ocean Vuong read at our open mics when he was 17 years old. Jhumpa Lahiri threw her first book party in our space when she was still a debut writer. So we're there for you if you have a story to tell, and we think that that's a story that needs to be heard. We have a lot of programs, too much to explain, but we work on the intimate level of fellowships, the community-based level of events and public programs, and the more public level of book publishing and online magazines. So at the most intimate level, we give out fellowships every year to Asian American writers. How many of you are writers in this room? So a lot of you. So you're in the right place. So if you keep an eye on our email blast on our website, we give out about 12 fellowships a year, and a lot of the fellows have gone on to publish their first novel or first poetry book. And a lot of past fellows include, very notable writers like Monique Trung, Kathy Park Hong, Tina Chang, Bino Ray Luyo, and in our newest generation, writers like Rowan Heseo Buchanan, Yan Yi, the newest Yale Younger Poet, Tani Nandini Islam. So we give out fellowships. So if you like free money, that's free money. Secondly, we do public events like these almost every week. If you look on our website, you can see the calendar. And we don't see ourselves as just doing literary readings. We see it as a way of creating events and creating a public space for ideas that might not be recognized in the mainstream. So if you want to participate in our open mic, or meet your favorite author, or meet your future spouse or best friend, which has happened, come to our events. And finally, if you just go to aaww.org, we publish the online magazine The Margins, and we publish new poetry, interviews, essays, fiction every weekday, actually. And if you're a writer, you should definitely submit work to us on our Submittable. That's a lot of stuff that we do. In the last 2 years, we've actually given out more than $250,000 to writers of color. So if that sounds good, you know, buy the t-shirt, make a donation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to say a few thank yous. First of all, I think there's seats for everyone, but if there's not enough room, they have an overflow room where you can see everything on the TVs. I want to first of all thank DVAN. This is really their event, and we're just the hired help. Special thanks to Isabel, Thong, and Viet, who, you know, let's give them a big hand. I know this has been a real labor of love. I also want to thank Tiffany from our staff, who's been doing a lot of running around, as well as everyone volunteering from AWW and Greenlight, the bookseller. Also, as you may have seen, let's do another round of... and also, special thanks to the People's Forum, who graciously agreed to accommodate us at the last minute when we switched, because so many of you awesome, beautiful people wanted to see this event. So I recommend you to come back to this space. It's a really important kind of leftist cultural space that's trying to create working class consciousness and cross-national alliances. So I think it's a really important space that we're all here. A few more quick thank yous. Thank you to NYU APA Institute, which is co-sponsoring this, and also thank you to the New York Southeast Asian Network, which has helped and promoted this. They're a great email list for Southeast Asian events in the city. Also, thank you to the Poetry Coalition, which is a network of poetry nonprofits, and they have a theme around democracy and citizenship, which this falls under. We have a really amazing lineup today, and I think this event fits into the workshop's vision as creating a counterculture. And as you all know, being that lone Asian person in the room, or being part of, you know, an Asian club or affinity group, a community isn't something that just exists. It's something that has to be created. And it's created when we all come together and say, we matter and we belong. And one thing that has been important for me is understanding AWW as a counterculture, like a bohemian, radical space, too weird for the mainstream. And I think particularly a counterculture where it's actually not about all of us being the same. It's all about our differences. Even if we're all the same ethnicity or the same gender, or if we're all Asian American, we're all united because in our, within that community, we can be normal and not be burdened with representation. Weirdly enough, like the biggest Asian American story in the last year or two has been the idea of Asian Americans voting for Trump, or wealthy Chinese Americans fighting affirmative action, or wealthy East Asians who do not think that demographic data should be disaggregated, and you know, otherwise it would go out how wealthy they are. So we're in this age where the idea of Asian American is under suspicion or challenged or seems meaningless. And for us, I think the project of the workshop is not merely to just have a descriptive relationship with Asian American, like you're from Asia, so here you are, but to kind of constantly intervening and articulating what that actually means. And for us, it's about creating a sanctuary space against a certain kind of American nationalism. So if you're a Muslim writer of color, if you're a migrant or a refugee, if you're someone who doesn't belong because of your race or your gender or your migration status, then AWW, or this community that we're creating, is a sanctuary space for that kind of imagination. So we're in this age where Asian American seems to just be a census category. But, you know, decades ago, that was a word that didn't mean anything. You were Chinese American, you were Vietnamese American, Filipino American, and the phrase only had any meaning within the moment of the Asian American movement. And that movement was only created out of opposition to the Vietnam War. So there's a way where I think for some people, like the idea of Southeast Asians or Vietnamese Americans is marginal, but I think for us, it's really central to the idea of what Asian American means. I've been doing this research project around colonialism everywhere. And I was recently in a colonial archive in London, and I just sat for days taking pictures with my phone, and I read about detainment camps in Yemen, in Malaysia, in Kenya, in Aden. And I also read about these British colonial officers who were saying things like, you know, you're trying to put people in concentration camps in Malaysia, and I'm trying to do that too in Kenya. We should swap notes because, you know, we can use our strategies to like help oppress the people, you know. And in America, the same things happened where during, you know, the wars in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, you know, the texts that were used were things like the Battle of Algiers or the records of the Vietnam War. So in the same way that, you know, the imperialist or the colonizer can take information across the four corners of the world, I guess we're here to be on the other side and to be, you know, the people on the receiving end of the colonial gaze. And we can come together as bodies and create a community that's founded on difference and looks at power from the other end of the gaze. We have a really amazing event. Many of the most prominent writers in the country are here. I'll just quickly announce them, but we're not going to have a formal intro because you can see all the bios and the programs. Next, you'll hear from Viet, and then we're going to have 3 panels in a row. The first one featuring Abigail Rosewood, Amy Kwan Berry, Hugh Min Win, and Amy Cook. Then the second one featuring Than Ha Lai, Violet Coopersmith, Vu Tran, and Lawrence-Minh Bui. And then third one featuring Maddie Huynh, Monique Trung, Viet Nguyen, and Isabel Tui Palaud. But it's my honor next to introduce Viet Thanh Nguyen, who has read with us before. We've published interviews with him, and you know he's won every award and has a wonderful Star Wars shirt. Let's give him a hand.
All right. Ken, thank you for that revolutionary preface. That's exactly what we needed. New York City, I'm so glad to be here. I am totally excited. I am so excited. I am wearing my Vietnamese American t-shirt. Star Wars, featuring Kelly Marie Tran as Rose Tycho. Kelly Marie Tran, probably the most famous Vietnamese American in the world today. But we were so excited to have Kelly Marie Tran representing us in Star Wars, but not everybody was so excited. There were some people out there who did not want more women in Star Wars, did not want any Vietnamese people in Star Wars, and look, they got 2 Vietnamese women in Star Wars in that movie. But the reaction against Kelly Marie Tran reminded me of my own childhood. I grew up in San Jose, California. Woo! Maybe not so woo, it was okay. Very multicultural city, but I went to this primarily white high school. Now, there were a handful of us who were of Asian descent, and we knew we were different in some way. We just weren't quite sure how to put it into words. So every day at lunch, we would gather in a corner of the campus, and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. The funny thing is, I went back to campus a couple of years ago to give a talk to all the students, and as it turns out, we really have taken over. It's another story. But the Asian Invasion, the funny thing is, we hadn't invaded anybody. If anything, the United States had invaded us. But of course, we didn't really have the words for that when we were 14 years old. And looking back at my 14-year-old self, looking back at high school in San Jose in the 1980s, I can safely say that what I needed, what we all needed, were more voices, more stories, featuring people like us, featuring people like my parents, who were refugees from Vietnam. So my parents came to San Jose in 1978, and they opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California, which is what you're supposed to do when you're an immigrant or a refugee. Pursue the American dream. So it's kind of funny that I was walking down the street one day from my parents' store when I was about 10 or 11, and I saw a sign in a store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And I thought, does this person know that my parents work 12 to 14-hour days in this store almost every day of the year? Does this person know that my parents were shot in this store on Christmas Eve? Does this person know anything about my parents and what they have been through to become the people that they are and get to this country. And of course, that person didn't know that, didn't care to know that. That person did not have the stories that he or she needed to make sense out of people who were different than they were. So, we need more stories. And I didn't realize at the time that those of us who were Asian Americans were living in an age of narrative scarcity, which means that almost none of the stories were about us. You know you're a part of the so-called majority when almost all of the stories are about you. And you live in narrative plenitude, a luxury that we don't have. And looking back at this time, I was thinking, why were we living in narrative scarcity? And of course, one answer is structural racism, structural inequality. But I'll tell you another important reason for narrative scarcity. Asian parents. You know I'm telling the truth. Those of you who are Asian parents or going to be Asian parents, do better. Don't crush the dreams of your artistic children. Nourish them, encourage them, grow them, until one day they can write scathing autobiographies featuring you. I don't think any of our writers today have actually done that, but we will see if they will one day. So we're at this incredible moment right now where we have 9 Vietnamese American authors and artists to share the stage tonight. And the amazing, even more amazing thing, it's not the first time. Last year we did this at the San Jose Museum of Art with 9 writers. Next year we're going to go to Seattle to finish the trilogy of our speaking tour with 9 other writers. That's a lot of Vietnamese American writers. That's about 27 more than we had in 1984. So we've made progress. But we haven't made enough progress. We can't possibly say that today we live in an age of narrative plenitude when it comes to Vietnamese or Vietnamese Americans or Asian Americans. And we're not going to get to that age of narrative plenitude solely on the work of writers. We need the writers, of course. We need the writers to produce stories. But writers work in solitude, and what we need is solidarity. Without solidarity, without social movements, we are not going to have narrative plenitude. Because without equal access to the means of representation and production, we do not control the context of our stories. The literary industry is 87% white, which is about as white as the state of Idaho. Perfectly nice state. I visited there. Wouldn't want to live there. 87% white. In 1955, James Baldwin wrote that this world is no longer white and will never be white again. But a publishing industry that lionizes James Baldwin and yet is 87% white is still quite white. And that has to change. And that won't change simply because of great authors. That changes because of movements of solidarity and activism. So, until we reach this moment of revolution, we have the Asian American Writers Workshop and we have the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. So I just want to tell you a little bit about DVAN. It started when some of us were students back in the 1990s, and we founded a group called Ink and Blood. Very melodramatic. But we believed at that time that it wasn't just writing that was important, it was organizing. It was creating venues and spaces like this to support the work of Vietnamese American writers and artists. And over the years, we morphed into the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. We've done many, many, many things. Go to dvan.org to check them out. That would include our very active blog that publishes new writers and reviews and so on in case you want to contribute. That's diacritics.org. And of course, we will hit you up for money periodically throughout this night. But Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network is committed both to the practice of art and also to the practice of solidarity and growing a Vietnamese diasporic literary and artistic community. I am so proud, so excited to be here with DVAN and Asian American Writers Workshop tonight. I can't imagine a better forum than the People's Forum to hold this event. So, with that, I'm going to take a break. We're going to bring up our first panel. Chill out for just 30 seconds while we do this, and it's going to be incredible. Thank you.
Anything else? No
Okay, while they're setting up, social media, Twitter, the hashtag is
DVAN.
DVAN, D-V-A-N, okay? And just DVAN. And you can also tag at AAWW. If you find it in your heart of hearts to donate in cash, this is Tang Dao. She will collect cash. Otherwise, go to dvan.org to donate online. And I believe we're ready with our first panel. All right.
Yes. Yes. That's all right. Hello, can everyone hear me? Everyone who can hear? Thank you. So yeah, we have 3 mics we're going to share. They asked us to keep the mics off until you use it so that there's no feedback as we accidentally touch mics. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all the organizers for bringing us all together. So my name is Mimi. I'm going to do quick names down here. We have Hugh, Amy, and Abby, and we're going to kick off our conversation tonight. So as a moderator, I wanted to ask a question about community. So we're gathered here today. We are gathered here today to not get married, but to bring together Vietnamese American and Vietnamese diasporic writers and artists into a community together. But many of us don't know each other. In this group of 9 writers and artists have not met each other before. Some of us do, but some of us don't. So I personally know Hugh, and I met Abby last night, and I met Amy just earlier today. And so I want to ask a question about how we understand community and how we build community as writers. So for each of you, the first question is, who do you see as your literary community? So not so much who you write for, but who do you write with? Who do you think with, write with, feel with, eat with? Eating is very important when we're writers. Who are those communities that you are doing your creative work with? And then as Vietnamese American, Vietnamese diasporic writers, how do you see your relationship to a Vietnamese diasporic artistic community, which may overlap with your sense of community, but maybe not, if that makes sense?
I can try to start. Hi, I'm Hugh. I think I'm going to ramble a little bit until I find an answer, if that's okay.
Find your way there.
Oh, yeah, well, I'll figure it out. I think, I think we hear these broad terms like poetry community, right, or like writing community. And first of all, poetry is a genre, right, and it's not I think of community on a smaller scale, right? I don't think I think community is a group of people who share the same curiosities as you, and you are all invested in trying to figure out a thing together. And there is an investment in the people around you not failing. And it's also not only for you, right? You also have to give back to it, if that makes sense.
So sort of like reciprocal relationship between you and a community.
Yeah. I'm gonna pause before I start rambling on too much.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Amy Kwan-Barry. The question of community for me is one that's really interesting. I had a bit of a unique upbringing, so I'm definitely here as a representative who's stretching the boundaries of what it means to be a member of a diaspora. I was born in Vietnam in 1973. I'm half black, I'm half Vietnamese. I left Vietnam in 1974. I'm transracially adopted. My family, I was raised primarily on the North Shore of Boston. My mother is German American, my father is Irish American. So when I refer to my family today, that's who I'm referring to. I don't know my family in Vietnam. I wasn't raised speaking Vietnamese. I wasn't raised within a Vietnamese culture. I know much more about Germany and about Ireland than I do about anything else. So having said that, for me, the idea of community has always been interesting because I've kind of seen myself as being sort of a pan community. Like I feel like I belong to many different communities. It's true that when I was growing up, for example, the few times on the playground when children would call me racial slurs, they would refer to me as the N-word, right? So growing up, I didn't necessarily think of myself as being Asian, but I've always been proud to tell people that yes, I was born in Vietnam. And usually people are very surprised by that. They're like, "You're born." They give me a second look, they're trying to figure it out, they're looking at my nose specifically, like, oh yeah, we see it in the nose. So something about that. But having said that, then for me, I think one of the reasons why I started writing was because I was curious to see what somebody like me would write. You know, I didn't see myself in any communities, and so that's the reason why I decided to find out what kinds of stories am I interested in telling, et cetera, et cetera. And so in thinking about it, I say this again with all humility, and I feel very privileged to be here, but I do, in some ways, this sounds very broad, but I'm not saying that I see myself as like the future in certain kinds of ways in which we are all members of the human community, which sounds a little bit cliche. And I definitely, as a black person in the United States, I definitely understand when people are like, I don't see race, I don't see color. When somebody says that to me, but at the same time, I do think that I'm lucky to be in this privileged position where because I don't necessarily ascribe to any community, that it allows me then to tell narratives and to do the research to tell narratives that perhaps don't fit my phenotype, that perhaps are not communities into which I was born. Again, it's very much a process, though, of doing my responsibility, of doing due diligence when I do write about other communities. So, for example, just really briefly, my first novel was set in Vietnam, and I like to say, and I really do, I believe this, and like I said, I say it with all humility, but I feel like that novel about Vietnam, I feel like it was written by a black girl, in the sense that I did my research, I went to Vietnam 4 times, I don't speak Vietnamese, I did what I had to do, and I wrote that book. And I do think, though, that in many ways, obviously, being born in Vietnam has given me sort of a pass in certain kinds of ways, that people perhaps, if I were white, would read that book differently and through a different lens. But the next book that I'm working on actually is set in Mongolia, and it follows some Buddhist monks in Mongolia. I'm not Mongolian, I'm not Buddhist, I'm not a man, but again, hopefully I've done my research there, and it allows me, again, to tell these stories that I'm interested in telling. So community is definitely something that I think about a lot, but I do really believe that if you do your research, that you can write across community and beyond community.
Hi, I'm Abigail Rosewood. The question about communities, I feel like I'm still striving to find one, and being here today is part of that effort. And I feel like in the past, in order to find community for me, it's been, as a writer, to admit to my weakness, which is depression, being suicidal. And I find that a lot of artists have felt this way, a lot of writers, many of my friends. And so I think in that sense, I feel a part of a community that's battling these inner demons. and trying to make sense of it using art and words. Yes.
Thank you for that. Let's talk mental health. So mental health is my area, and so I'm really excited that you brought that up. To answer sort of my own question for myself, I see myself in a community of like ill and disabled and suffering folks who are dealing with mental health issues, and I think of myself as a person in that community, but also a writer working through that. So I appreciate you bringing that up, but I also like you bringing that up in relation to thinking about the conditions that we are all writing in and the suffering that writers and artists are experiencing and how that comes through in our work. And maybe that links a little bit to Hugh, what you're saying in terms of shared curiosities, but also commitments to answering certain kinds of questions. And I'm wondering how much the issues that Abby's bringing up around suffering are part of those curiosities for you, and for Amy too, in terms of thinking about writing inside and outside of communities, how much kind of the pains of those communities we're trying to work through, be accountable to, make sense of.
So in thinking about it, I feel very lucky in my life to be where I am and to be fairly stable. But it's true that when I was younger, I very much struggled with issues of identity, which then were expressed through depression and things like that. In the town where I grew up, everybody sort of knew my story and knew how I was raised and knew about my family. But then when I went away to college in the South, and again, I came from the Boston area, I had a lot of difficulty navigating, like, well, who am I now in spaces where people don't know me? And I did find myself dealing quite a bit with issues in mental health at that time. In thinking about it, something I think because of that, I'm very much interested in this idea of trauma and of documenting trauma and of writing about trauma in all kinds of ways. So I write, again, I'm both a poet and a fiction writer. Many of my poems deal with trauma not just in Vietnam, but in other places in Asia and also in the United States. So that's something that I'm very interested in writing about. I'm interested specifically in documenting various atrocities and horrors that have happened in the 20th century and beyond. And I'm also interested in just presenting questions. I mean, I think you can never have answers to the suffering that happens in this world. Like, there are no answers, but just by exploring it and documenting it and making it, having us understand our own participation in it in various ways, I think that has gone a long way for me in thinking about these things. I will just say one more thing too, that another area in which I found myself quote unquote suffering, which again is a strong word, but has to do with this idea of gatekeepers. And thinking about, we talked a bit about it today in some conversations I had with other writers, the idea of like, who decides who you are? Who decides like what it means to be Asian? Who decides what it means to be Vietnamese? Who decides what it means to be black? That's definitely something that I've struggled with a lot in my life, particularly when I was younger. The idea that, oh, you're not black enough, or oh, you're not Asian enough, or oh, you're not this enough. And I do think that many of those kinds of issues, going back to your earlier question about community, can be addressed when one does find one's place in the world. Oftentimes that maybe perhaps isn't just ethnic communities, but just community of writers, community of poets, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that in many ways, again, finding your community can really help you address those things.
I started writing poetry when I was 14, so I was like suffering a lot, you know?
14's a hard age.
Yo, 14, would never do it again. And I used it, you know, as a high schooler who was like closeted and deeply ashamed as like a way to kind of create the person I wanted to be, right? So I'd write love poems about girls, and I would write poems that like, I was also like performing these poems regularly out loud to people. Don't know why, but I would also write poems that would I would make fun of myself for being Asian, right? Or I would make fun of myself for being fat, just as a kind of defense mechanism, right? So I was able to, through poetry, like make myself untouchable, right? It was this shield that I had, and I remember that shift happened when I came out to my mother, and she rejected me, told me I was diseased and sick and ill, or all these things that at the time I used poetry then to talk about that suffering, right? And my mother doesn't speak English, doesn't write in English, doesn't read English, and so there was this freedom of being able to write in a language that she didn't have access to. And so I felt safety also in assimilation, right? Felt safety in being more American than Asian, right? And so I held I conflated the hurt I felt with being Vietnamese, because I couldn't understand why these white children could have accepting parents, but I couldn't. And the only factor was that my mother was Vietnamese. But poetry also now has taught me to remove myself from the center of any event so I can see everything else. It allows me to shrink myself in order to see the larger world. And yeah, I think writing about suffering, my own, but also being able to see past that into like right towards forgiveness, or like to see the potential landscape past my suffering. Does that make sense? Cool.
I also like the idea of like you're saying when you say shrink yourself to see around you.
Yeah.
I understand that also as, and tell me if I'm totally interpreting this wrong, but as being able to see the larger context and forces that surround that pain, right? That the pain is deeply individual, but also comes out of structures around you, right?
Yeah.
That are
To
causing and
understand
shaping that pain.
That the reason someone hurts you isn't to hurt you, right? But there are other things in motion, right? To see the world past the hurt, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Abby?
Oh, sorry.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I guess for me, I feel like, as with most things that you feel like you can't have, then you pretend you don't need it. And so for a long time, that's what I've done, which is because I was working, not a lot of people around me were Vietnamese, and I didn't have that community, so I just distanced myself from it, and I just told myself I don't need it. And I feel like I'm still learning, and yeah, just that's all.
Something that struck me from what Amy said earlier was about who gets to say whether you belong or don't belong or what community you're part of, but also in relation to us talking about writing through pain and suffering and trauma, I also have the question of who gets to say what kinds of pains and traumas count or should be published about, should be written about, want to be consumed or read by an audience. Does that make sense? And so some of my own anxieties about writing through, say, war trauma or other kinds of areas that Vietnamese writers and artists tend to work with is the public consumption of that kind of pain. Like, I'm all about writing about pain. We should all write about pain. Life fucking sucks and we should write about it. But who's reading the life fucking sucks, right? And who wants to hear about my life sucking and why, if that makes sense? And I'm wondering if that's something you all have come up against as you're thinking about how much of yourself to be how to make yourself vulnerable in your writing, how that is received or consumed, or do you have any kind of anxieties around that or feelings around that kind of consumption of trauma? Does that make sense as a question? Okay.
Yeah. So when I was in a workshop with a professor, she gave this great advice. She said, well, she said this quote, every time a writer is born into a family, the family is dead. And and I feel like that was great but it also gave me courage in a way to fictionally kill that family or to stand up to that family and to work with my pain, my trauma, and what that family has caused and not be afraid to speak up to it. Yes.
I love that so much.
And also in thinking about it, you know, and thinking about my experiences, again, something that I identify with, so a lot of African-American authors, you know, talk a lot about the idea of black joy and black pain. And again, oftentimes when we talk about black pain, we're not specifically just talking about African-American people. You know, we're talking about brown people, we're talking about marginalized people, we're talking about LGBTQ people. So again, I use black as sort of shorthand when I talk about the idea of black pain. And something that I've just been thinking about a lot, so a friend of mine who's actually Jewish, who adopted an African-American boy, and she's a poet, and she gave a reading in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live, and she'd written quite a few poems about police brutality. And when I went to her reading, it made me realize that there's a hole that I identify in literature right now, that a lot of black poets, a lot of brown poets, et cetera, are writing about these issues, but a lot of white poets are not. You know, in some ways, I think that because she now has an African-American son, she feels that she needs to be addressing these things. But it made me realize that I actually want to be reading more poems by all kinds of people about police brutality. Like, it shouldn't just be black poets who are writing about this. In some ways, I'm thinking about, you know, Vietnamese Americans, it shouldn't just be us writing about the Vietnam War. That's not to say that there might be people out there who do it badly. And I always tell my students that in many ways, I think the simplest contract, and it's true that many of my graduate students and my undergraduates do not agree with me about this. And there might be people here who don't agree with me about this either. But I really do feel that the author, the artist, has the right to create whatever work it is that they want to create, and that the viewer or the audience then has the right to be offended. And to me, that's the contract. Like, you have the right to do it, and somebody else has the right to be offended. It's true that it's more complicated, and I recognize that nobody has the right to a book contract, nobody has the right to a movie contract, et cetera, et cetera. But just on the most basic level, I do feel like when it comes to pain, that it's human pain, and that we should all be writing each other's stories, even though at times it does take courage, you know, to step outside yourself and to imagine yourself in another space and to try and document that.
I was talking to Matt earlier about this, about the expectation that comes with being like a Vietnamese poet or a queer poet, especially when organizations or institutions bring you out, and there's a level of expectation of what you need to do, right? And oftentimes, you know, they see that you're Vietnamese, right? They're like, oh, we want you to talk about the Vietnam War. And I'm just like, I wasn't there. And so there's, and that also comes with its own parameters, right? What can you talk about that? They want to see, like, they want the refugee narrative. They want to hear about the bombs. They want to hear all about the suffering, right? Where my mother often talks to me about how she had a great time at the refugee camp. Her and her sister, they like ran wild. Because they were teenagers. They were young adults during the war, and they did young adult things. And there were moments, sure, there was a war happening, but there were moments when they were lucky enough to forget and be children. And I think those are the moments that I think need to be heard more, right? Rather than just like doing what is expected, if that makes sense.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that really speaks to me too, what you're saying about certain expectations for writing about the Vietnam War. I feel like when people go into a bookstore and pick up a book by a Vietnamese author, that's often the expectation, like, is it going to address the Vietnam War? And, you know, I came to the US 12 going on 13, and after the war, and so I was in Vietnam in a peaceful time, and I came as an immigrant, not as a refugee. So when I came, I took the Vietnam flag with me, and I hung it in my bedroom. And then my mom came in and was horrified, and she said, "Take that off. Like, we're in Houston, Texas. You're gonna get in trouble for this." And so that's when I sort of realized, like, there are different views about what it means to be Vietnamese, and for that moment, I felt like it was something I needed to hide. Yeah, so.
Thank you. So actually, we're going to wrap up, yeah? Actually, let's transition. So thank you so much for the three of you for this conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. Yes. Thank you. Yes. So we're going to transition now to the second panel.
Just want to draw your attention to the fact that there is a quality survey in your brochure. Please fill it out and drop it off. And I think there'll be a box by the door when you leave. So that'd be really great if you could do that.
Okay, hello everyone. We are going to go ahead and flow into our second panel. Can I ask us to start with a round of applause for our first panel, for our hosts and organizers. Thank you so much everyone for being here. A reminder that social media, hashtag DVAN, hashtag AAWW. If you're interested in donating to support, cash here. And also a reminder to support the writers after the program. We'll have books on sale and signing in the front, so encourage you to get a book and get your book signed. I am your moderator for this session. I'm Lawrence-Minh Davis. I'm going to do a quick across the panel introductions. We have Violet Cooper-Smith, Teng Ha Lai, and Vu Chan. So I was sort of imagining that we would pick up where the last panel left off, maybe with some of those important questions, but then I'm kind of instead seduced to going in a different direction. So we're going to start off by talking about Vietnamese diasporic ghost stories. Woo! Okay, Violet, take it away.
I write ghost stories about the Vietnamese diaspora. I am a fan of this question. If it is a I mean, to my fellow Vietnamese people, do you have ghost stories in your families or very superstitious grandparents? It's a thing, and it has haunted my entire childhood. And when I started writing creatively, it was what I went to mine first. I mean, I actually started writing ghost stories because in a creative writing class in college, I had a plot hole that I couldn't figure out how to fill. And so I needed a character that could sort of defy the laws of physics. And that was how the ghosts crept in. And so I've been chasing them ever since. But Vietnamese ghosts are spectacularly weird in the pantheon of ghost stories. And I think it's like a perfect, beautiful metaphor for the immigrant or for any in-between person. Myself, I'm half white and half Vietnamese, and I do see myself in the figure of the ghost as someone sort of trapped in between worlds as a liminal figure.
All right, so ghost stories. All right, let's see. I live ghost stories because I lived through the war, all right? So the younger ones, I'm the one of the older ones. I lived through the war. I was 10 when I left in 75, and my father remains missing in action. So he's my ghost, all right? So every story you read from me is going to have someone missing in action. That's just what I do. That's my way of remembering them. And I was trying to create a father figure for one of my stories, and I can't do it. Everybody's missing in action. So if you're going to be a dad in my story, you're gone. That's just how I do it. I can't even make it up. So now I have a 12-year-old, and I'm watching my husband interact with her, and I literally do things like, oh, that's what a dad does. Because I didn't, it just isn't there. Now, I can't get up here and tell you a sad story about how, oh, I miss my dad so much, because I just never knew him. I was one when he left, so I only hear stories about him. So my ghost stories are the actual stories that I've inherited from my mom, of course, who knew him, and from the older brothers and sisters. I'm the 9th child, so I'm the youngest. So I know all kinds of things about this man that I will never meet. I don't know if they're true or not. So I guess they could be ghost stories, right? So they've haunted me. So every story you see from me is going to have one of those. Okay.
I too am very stoked about this topic.
Yes.
I could talk about ghosts for a long time. Sadly, I have never had a supernatural experience. I've actually been hoping to meet up with a ghost, and I really want this to happen because I've been fascinated by the ghost narrative all my life. Like you, I've written ghost stories. When I was growing up, I wrote fairy tales, but ghosts would always creep in, so it would become a kind of gothic ghost story. And I'm writing a gothic novel right now with ghosts. The thing that I've always been interested in is and this is just my experience, but when I hear ghost stories, it's usually an individual experience. It's rarely like a collective experience. Like when people tell a ghost story, they don't usually talk about encountering this ghost with other people. It's usually alone. So in my mind, as someone who's never experienced this, I've always seen it as haunting to me is always a self-haunting. And so ghost stories inevitably in my mind becomes a story about oneself, like one's deepest fears, one's deepest questions, one's deepest uncertainties. And as a writer, I think when ghost stories crop up, it's a wonderful way for me to end up talking about that character, right? And of course, there's always the element of inheritance. The ghost stories I know are inherited from my mom, right? And she's a great story. Not inherited my dad, because my dad's a terrible storyteller. But those stories that your mom tells you, inevitably, she's talking about you. And in my mind, at least as a writer, I feel like it's a wonderful way to talk about my characters, and of course, inevitably talking about myself.
So my earliest ghost story is also from my mom, and she told me as how when she was a young child, she would wake up, and at the foot of her bed there would be a severed leg walking back and forth, like a spectral leg. And that she went to her mom, my grandmother, and was like, there's a fucking leg every night. And what do we do with that? And her mom's like, oh, yeah. My grandma was like, yeah, that is the leg of Vietnamese soldier that was thrown down the well outside by the French. And it's always here, and it's always going to be here because it's kind of unhappy with that way of dying. And you just got to get used to it. And that was the story. So, I'm thinking about that story being over there, and the idea that we have these inherited ghost stories that seem to be over there, but that they make sense for us in our work metaphorically, or ways to work through ideas and issues. But then also, It's reminiscent for me of like the Latin American tradition or the kind of origination of magical realism as a form, whereby there's a kind of different experience of reality that works outside of the bounds of rational understanding that we sort of, or parts of our community feel a need to push against. And I think an interesting question for us that maybe we've sort of started dipping into, but I want to push on a little bit more, is as we are figuring out Vietnamese diasporic literary work and community, what it means is like this kind of idea of continual creation or imagining into being, as Ken referenced earlier, our community. How is it a political act to think about ghost stories for you? Or is it? Or can it be?
Well, you know, I've always found it interesting. I'm not sure about this, but it seems most other cultures in the world are infused with the notion of ghosts. I think America is one of the few places where it's not ingrained in the culture. We know in the culture as an entertainment or as you know, an element of superstition. But you know, magic realism, for example, is about the culture. It's like it's not magic. It's actually people believe in that. That's their everyday life in certain cultures, whether it's South America, Africa, Asia, right? And so I feel like when certain communities or certain people talk about ghosts, they're really talking about their culture. So it's inevitably a political act because it's a commentary and an excavation of who they are. It is not just, you know, a confession of I'm superstitious, I've experienced this really cool, you know, it's not a campfire story necessarily, right? It's a reflection of who they are and who their people are. And it's troubling, not just scary.
Okay, now it's on. All right. So if you write about what interests you, it automatically becomes a political act because you're putting a statement on it saying, this is important, pay attention, this is what I'm writing about, and if you come from my brain, you're going to talk about the war. It's just there. I grew up there, it is. And if you come from another brain, you're going to talk about whatever else that interests you. And that is, you know, and you don't even have to put a stamp on it on the front page saying, this is a political novel. It just is, all right? Don't worry about it. That is the least of your problems as a writer. Okay, that's like nothing. You're going to be sitting alone in a room, probably a very small room, especially if you live in New York City. You're not going to have sun, the heat will be too hot, and you're going to be in there for not days, not weeks, people, years. And then it will be decades. And then it just keeps going. And then as soon as you publish one novel, you know what happens? Your editor will send you an email saying, so, what's next? You're like, huh? That's just, you've chosen this life. So the political acts, yeah. Okay, whatever. What you really need to be worrying about is how to sit in that room for a really long time while you're overheating and thinking about things like, I should be at Alvin Ailey taking a dance class, and you're not. Or, I should be raising chickens. You're not. You have no land, okay? Because why do you have no land? Because you're a writer, all right? This is what happens to you. So I'm just very practical. I'm just trying to make you understand this is what I think about. The political, I don't know. I don't know anything about that. All I know is I have to sit there day after day. There's no community. I don't even know what you're talking about. It's just me in front of my very old laptop, typing, and then this is what happens. You erase everything. And you're like, ah! And then you do it again. So I'm just, is that political? So that in itself is political, but you don't have to stamp it. You just live it, okay? Well.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. That's what I'm.
I mean, well, for me, the ghost becomes political, in that I can use the figure as a way for the character to behave badly, to deviate, and to do things that I wouldn't feel comfortable for another character to do, and to allow it to convey. I don't have like ulterior political things really in my writing, but the ghost can do it for me.
I guess some of what I was driving at is like when my mom mentioned this story, she also added at the end, maybe don't tell your white friends about this story. And I see that as political in the sense of like, because they'll think you're crazy, because this story can't circulate in the same way outside of this space as it does here. And that in itself, that kind of like invalidation of what counts as reality for us is a kind of political thing. And so I'm thinking about it in that way. Maybe to jump sideways from that, Tangha, you mentioned no community, or a feeling of like that kind of isolation as a writer.
I did it to myself.
So I'm coming from a different place as a curator whose job is always to like grab people and gather them together. And we have this moment today where we've been talking all day and like figuring out what we're doing here. And I think that's some of the point here is like figuring out Vietnamese American literary community as we go. And I wonder if we could reflect a little bit more on that beyond the kind of immediate writing life. What do we want out of Vietnamese diasporic literary community? What are we looking for? What do we have already that feels like something we need to talk about?
I just want stories that surprise me, all right? So read. There are plenty of stories out there already, lots. Then give me something else. That's what I want. So every time I read something, I want to be surprised. I'm like, wow. And it can be something tiny. It doesn't have to be a huge manifesto of I am this Vietnamese person. It's just something. And that's what and please, for God's sakes, make it funny. You know, just a little something. I want to laugh. That's what I want.
Just more stories. That's what we're doing today. We're kicking open a lot of different little doors for each other and just doing this. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if people think this, but you know, maybe sometimes people think a community, especially if you're an artistic community, that you're somehow then kind of you're doing it together and holding hands, and that you, in a sense, dilute yourself through that. And I've never thought of it that way. I grew up in Oklahoma. I was the only Asian dude around. And in many ways, it's not that I like that, I just got so used to it that I kind of really appreciated being on the outside and looking in, because I think it taught me to be more thoughtful and critical in ways I otherwise would not be. And the thing, this kind of overlaps with your last kind of, you were illuminating the idea of what it means to be political. For me, being political is imposing yourself. The thing that I've learned most about as a writer when I became a good writer is when I felt, okay, I'm imposing on the writer my worldview, how I see the world. They might not agree with it, but I am giving myself permission to impose myself, that this is worth reading and might be meaningful and of value to you. The good thing about a community, I've learned over the years, and I came to this late, I came to Chicago 9 years ago, and on my 5th year, I finally found a group of Asian friends. Never had I've had individual Asian friends, but never a group. And what I learned is that a community, a group, gives you permission to impose yourself. And that's really has been important for me. When you are unsure whether you know what you have to say is of value. So that is definitely one thing that has been valuable to me about a community.
So when you thinking about the idea of imposing yourself, and I'm thinking about Tangha saying, surprise me, bringing up this kind of relationship between what we're writing and who we're writing for. And I don't want to kind of like go into like an imagined audience kind of question, but maybe back to what Mimi brought up in the last session and the idea of the consumption of our work. And this idea of surprise, or this idea of expectation of what Vietnamese diasporic writers write about, or what it's maybe how the work that you write makes people feel about themselves, or about refugees, or about the Vietnam War, or about immigration more broadly. And I would love to hear what you think about, how you think about that. Like, not so much like the relationship between your work and an imagined audience, but how you feel about the consumption of your work, why people are reading it and taking something out of it.
People are reading my work because their teachers are making them. So I'm on the 8th grade curriculum. If you're in New York, sorry, it's your baby for about 4 months. And you know what? You can't even imagine your audience because they surprise you every single time, right? When I was writing my first novel, it was all about me as a refugee in Alabama, you know, trying to learn English and all that. I thought, who's gonna read this? And my agent, this is before prose poems became a thing, right? This was way before. And she said, this is gonna be a hard sell. And I'm like, probably. Yeah, I don't know anything about publishing. I don't know anything. And then my editor got a hold of it, and she goes, well, we'll try, okay? My advance was $5,000, okay? They expected nothing from this novel. They're like, okay, whatever, we'll just let you do it. And then it just happened that all the refugee things were happening, and then everybody was reading this. And then with the letters I get from students, it has nothing really to do with the refugee girl in the middle of the story. It just has to do with how they felt when they were reading about her. So then it becomes something else completely. So I have no idea who my readers are. I just write for me. I'm like, that's interesting. I'll do that. And then whoever else finds it interesting, then they do.
I see myself in the solar system of Vietnamese American writers as like a distant small planet circling full of ghosts. And I feel like the people who come to Planet, the Frangipani Hotel, my short stories, are looking, I feel like I am writing about the war, about refugees, about inherited trauma, about my vote stories. That's a very cute sign. But in a circuitous, odd, highly coded way. And I don't know who that is. Or we're not supposed to be imagining who are
Know your feelings.
Oh, my feelings. Oh, I'm getting in my feelings. For the half people weirdos. Because I think that's necessary. There's a place for me in this solar system.
I'm like most people. I only write for myself. I mean, obviously you have to have audience in mind sometimes when you write. But I kind of think that, anyone know who Aphex Twin is? Like, I'm a huge Aphex Twin fan. His artwork is all about superimposing his face on other things. I kind of see readership in that way, but it's not Richard D. James's face. It's my face, and I have to write that way. Anytime that kind of weird thing changes into someone more specific, I think I get in trouble because I'm trying to please them and not me. I mean, I feel like I can't please anyone unless I please myself. That's weird sounding, but you know what I mean.
Okay, thank you for. I think we've come to a good ending place of feelings. So, yeah. Imagine Vu's face hovering here for us while we change sets to the next group. Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause?
Before our third panel, we're going to show a brief video about the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, I believe. So that would just take a couple of minutes. Can we roll that video when we have the opportunity, please? I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen. I'm one of the co-founders of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. We started DVAN 10 years ago to provide a platform for Vietnamese American and Vietnamese diasporic artists, writers, and filmmakers.
I'm Isabelle Tuipelo, the co-director of DVAN. We came a long way. We started 10 years ago because we didn't see a story in mainstream society, in history book, in classes. It was nowhere to be seen and to be heard.
Hi, my name is Dao Strom, and I'm a new co-director with DVAN. The Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network's primary mission is to promote stories of the Vietnamese diaspora.
And because our history is marked by displacements, because a lot of our family was spread in different countries before and after the war, we wanted to bring those stories together. Our story matters, and we have power to change the world.
With your support, DVAN will be able to continue developing its projects. One of these is She Who Has No Masters, the work of the Women's Arts Collective. A second is continuing publications through our online journal, Diacritics. And a third area, creating literary events and writing retreats that bring together emerging and established writers.
We're thrilled to have received an anonymous donation to support our cause. We'd be more thrilled if you helped us match that donation.
With your contribution and with your support, DVAN will be able to continue doing this important work.
Okay, so everybody stand up and stretch a little bit. No? Okay, no. Okay, we're going to continue. Oh, thank you. All right. All right, so we're going to start. Oh, by the way, this is all the work by Matt Twin, who is, who is here in the back. Yes. And as you know, we have Viet Thanh Nguyen's here and Monique Trong, right? And Isabelle Pelot. Well, I'm listening to all those the panels. I'm having a flashback from Ink and Blood from 30 years ago when we started to do this work. And you remember I was telling we cannot talk about suffering, they will know we had to hide that suffering, and we try to tell poems and stories, but make sure the suffering doesn't show. So it's beautiful to see that 30 years later, this is expressed openly. And I also remember us trying to had the event around ghost stories, and we went there, and then we did not know any, but so many people came and listened to our ghost stories. So I just had this flashback. To follow up with this, well, I'm going to start since, this is really a DVAN event with Asian American Writers Workshop and poets and writers. When we started 30 years ago, we've been doing this, right, for 30 years. This, it seems like, it's great for us to all get together. And but I don't think, the audience, I don't know if you have a clue about what it takes for people to come together like this. I mean, first we have to fly people and host people in hotels. But we also, for 30 years, we had a lot of pushback. I mean, just very quickly, right? We've been at events when we bring writers together and we're told, we want to bring the picture of the beautiful Vietnamese people from the north right here, at the entrance. And saying, you cannot do this. Or we are told, don't, you can have Vietnamese American writers, but make sure they're 100% Vietnamese and, straight. Like very kind of Vietnamese Americans writers and say, well, no, we don't want to do that. And in other spheres, we've been told like, well, you can bring one. And said, no, we cannot do that. We're louder when we come together, right? And we have something important to say because I don't think we're really being heard. So as we go this, and I want to ask you, and you've been talking about plenitude and scarcity at the beginning. Another comments I often get is that stories is elitist. You should talk about and work to help the real people, right? And this is frivolous. I mean, I'm getting a lot from the organizing sides about pushing back, like this is not okay to do this kind of gathering, right? And it's been like this for a long time. So I would like to see from your perspective, what do you say to, what do you think your stories and the story of those who sat here before us and, and continue to write, why are they important and why is it important for us to come together? And it's okay, just speak about this, please.
All right, well, let me give, in case there's anybody out there who has this incredibly reductive mindset, I will give you two really, really short stories that impact most of the people in this room that are not told by professional storytellers. One I've actually already shared with you. Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese. That's a story in 9 words. We've heard it for centuries in this country. We just plug in different people in the Vietnamese slot. The other story that you've all heard, Make America Great Again. 4 words. It's a brilliant story. I hate the story, but it's a brilliant story because it's convinced a lot of Americans that it's true. So for me, stories are not just about art, which is we all believe in that, but stories are something we all participate in. Okay? And master storytellers know that. You can't organize a political cause without a story. How do you get people to go out there and sacrifice their bodies and their lives and their time if you can't give them a good story? So we work together, which is why I stressed from the very beginning both the solitude and the solidarity. And Tanya Lai is absolutely right. To be a writer, all that other stuff is, I think it's important. I think politics is important, okay? But you are right. 10,000 hours in a room is what it takes you to become a writer. If you can't do it, forget about it. Okay, that's the solitude part. The solidarity part is when you take that story and you bring it out into the world, and stories are more powerful when they're told together and shared together, and we're all in it together, whether we're artists or writers or activists. I think the artists and the writers understand that, and I just hope the activists would as well.
Hi. When I was a kid, I ate up American comic books because that's what I could get. There was not much of an Australian comics industry. There was none at all. So they were kind of like the bottom rack of the supermarket, and they were like any scrappy superhero comic I could grab. And I gravitated towards The Incredible Hulk. I loved The Incredible Hulk, right? And it was just like a visceral reaction. But in retrospect, I was attracted to these outsider monster stories, these stories of being misunderstood but also underestimated, like that you had more potential and these people don't know what's behind this nerdy scientist, And I always felt that way intuitively. And so when I started making comics, they were in the vein of these power fantasies and these escapist stories. But I quickly realized that I didn't see my community and my friends in those books, and I wanted to make the kind of stories where I could see that, the kind of books that I could see our community on the shelves. So that led me to trying to find a way into it, but without any mentors. Like I didn't I didn't go to an art gallery until I was like 18 or 20, like way after high school. We didn't have access to that. We didn't know any creative workers, let alone any artists. There was no model of like, you could be a designer or you could be an illustrator or anything like that. So I bumbled my way through it, and it cost me a lot, and I feel like I made a lot of unnecessary mistakes. And I wish I had the possibility that you could point to someone and say, oh, there's a Vietnamese writer, there's a Vietnamese artist, there's a Vietnamese cartoonist, or Asian, or whatever, however you identify. And also to have mentors, and I just kind of cherry-picked and collected them by myself, which is not easy because you're cold calling people. Some of them are in this room. And yeah, but like to be in that position now is significant. And I lament now that when I turn back and I have the opportunity to lift those stories up and exhibit them or curate them, and I turn around and a lot of that record of our experiences is lost because they all became accountants and lawyers, you know? So, like, yeah. I mean, like, I think, like now when I go back, that's the I'm sure you've experienced that with speaking about refugee camps and the war experience too, but the experience of first generation migrants, the kids, that's kind of lost too, because when there is a record, it's from the dominant news media or film or publishing, but it's not through these stories and experiences that, like me and my friends often share, hey, do you remember this happened? There's this thing. And there's no way to confirm it, but we have like a strong feeling that it did, but it makes you question your own reality and what really happened. And so the way to feel truthful when you can't verify anything is to turn to the feeling of what feels true. And that's made up, that's fiction. And so that's kind of what I go for, is like trying to invite people into a sacred space of what feels truthy.
Matt, I too gravitated to The Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
Yes, because I felt like I was full of anger. And in a way, to me, the Hulk and other stories like that was my version of seeing myself in art or in a narrative. You know, it felt that lonely that I was like, I remember as a child watching Mighty Mouse and thinking, oh, that's about me. I'm a mouse, but I'm, you know, I'm a superhero. To tie this back to the question, I was lucky enough actually to be part of that first series of panels that DVAN held in San Jose at the Art Museum. And one of the things that I said there was that when I first started writing, to me it was about, you know, with this intention of hoping that my younger sister, who's 11 years younger than I am, who was born in the States, would grow up not feeling so lonely. And by that, I really meant about just never seeing herself, you know, just not, I didn't want her to have to go to the Incredible Hulk. You know, I wanted her to have access to a narrative and to a visual world that had some reflection of who she is. So I think that the power to me of the story is in not feeling alone. And when you don't feel alone anymore, you feel more powerful. And when you feel more powerful, you get shit done.
I heard somewhere that if you don't see yourself mirrored in culture, the message that is sent to you emotionally is that I'm not there, and then if I'm not there, I don't deserve to be here. If I don't deserve to be here, then I don't deserve to exist, and poof, vanished. Yeah? So to not vanish and don't feel like you don't deserve to be here, or to exist, or to live, then it's vital. I will echo what he says, to have stories, right? So we all have, healthy beings and have a healthy world. Coming to preparing for coming here, I just had the graduate students coming to my office, and he was very excited. You met him, Phil. And he said, "You're going to meet the OJ." And I was like, OG. OG. Yeah, G and J. Yeah, there's a French thing, it's colonization there. I'm a product of colonization. It's only been 30 years. OG. And he said, and I made a fun, like, what? And he said, yes, original gangster. You're going to be with them. So I'm like, oh, wow. And then when I asked him what he meant by that, he said, like trailblazers, right? And then hearing about the other panelists, the idea of, you guys fought to find your own voice and to write and to draw the way you wanted to, for self-determinations. And then what you found in this process is that all you do is fight. Fight. Excess of power. There and there and there and there. It seems like there is a lot of fighting before you can even begin to speak. So I would like, for the audience who don't know too much about Vietnamese American literatures and the OG, well, you said it already, but if you articulate a little bit about what you're fighting, what you've been fighting against, which I think we're getting a little bit more clear, but also, what are you fighting for? And I'm really curious, back of my mind when I ask you these questions, about the role of the diasporic Vietnamese artists and writers, and how do you articulate this? How do you see that?
Well, let me just say, I don't think we're actually OGs. I think we're more like MAGs, middle-aged gangsters. Because I actually know some of the OGs. OGs are like, Lily Hayslip, not you, but just a few of us here. OGs are like Lily Hayslip and Mai Elliott. They were real trailblazers. I mean, we came in the wake of that. So imagine how hard it was to try to write books in the 70s and 80s, right? So we had some benefits. So for me, what am I fighting for? And I just want to say, I didn't really like The Incredible Hulk when I was growing up, but, I identified with Spider-Man, which probably says something about me, but anger, I like the anger part, and I don't think, we talked about a range of emotions of why we become writers and so on. For me, anger was big. It's still big. I write out of anger, varying levels of anger. And nevertheless, I'm a very nice guy. It's kind of weird. But what am I fighting for? Well, initially, yes. I mean, the idea of reflection is important. The idea of hearing our voices and our stories is important. But there's a danger to that I want to stress, which is, and I've heard it from many, many young writers, how do we tell our stories and not offend our parents? How do we tell our stories and not be protested by our community? And how do we pay respect to our community and yet still tell our vision? And for me, that was an important thing to get past, because actually I think that what I'm fighting for, and this is going to sound terrible, I fight for the truth in art. It's stupid, but it's true. And if the truth in art is against dominant white racist supremacy, that's good. But if the truth in art is against Vietnamese racism, for example, and there's a lot of Vietnamese racists, who I'm talking about, then you have to speak that truth, no matter if the community gets offended. If what we do is to say that our commitment is to art, and we're interested in reflecting or supporting the Vietnamese community, and we look at this Vietnamese community and we see alcoholism and domestic abuse and violence and gangsters and our uncles fleeing to Vietnam to marry second wives, all of which I've seen, you got to write about that. That's a reflection of the community too, and it's not a nice one, but it's our job to tell those stories as well.
I think yes, you can sort of spend your entire life fighting against things, but I like the way that you posed the question, what are you fighting for? You know, I think for me, it's about the possibility of complicating our narratives. And I think this is what Viet is talking about, not, you know, being able to write the full spectrum of who we are in the world. And it could be who we, you know, who you are or who your community is, however you want to define that. And I think that complication is really just another way of saying our full humanity. You know, I mean, so much of, I remember, you know, reading the very sort of studying Asian American literature in college and seeing that so much of the narratives had to sort of very much conform to the, you know, to the theme of what is it to be a Chinese American woman, for example. And like, we are just one sliver of what the spectrum is of that character or of that writer or of that artist. And so when I say about, you know, what I was saying about the reflection, it really is not just about, you know, is there an Asian person in your work or is there a Vietnamese element to your art? It's really however you want to complicate it. And this is why the previous panels were so amazing, because you see it happening, you see the complication, the troubling of the waters, and that is so fabulous. So thank you, all of you.
Yeah, I don't try to make work out of anger because I read The Incredible Hulk and I know what happens when you do stuff when you're angry. Well, when I think of, okay, I grew up in an area in Sydney called Cabramatta, and it's where they built the migrant hostels. And so after every period of conflict, that's where the migrants migrated. So it was a very Polish community, and then after the Vietnam War and the killing fields, it was like a lot of Cambodian, Chinese, Vietnamese, and then Middle Eastern, and more recently, Sudanese, okay? So a lot of my overtly activist political work, especially from clients, has to do with asylum seeker issues and when contemporary asylum seeker issues, because I always grew up very close to the skin, feeling like, but there for the grace of God go I, you know? So that's always been very close to me. But with my personal work, which has attracted this commissioned work, a lot of my work has been trying to get closer and closer to recognizing myself accurately in my own work. And that might be telling stories specifically about my kind of experience. And when I look at a lot of the work I've done, I see a lot of failure, because it's been a lot of work that I've been given permission to do, and I've been paid to learn about gaps in my knowledge, like the war itself, the war from the American perspective, with my work with the Historical Society, or the detention camps and the refugee centers and the boat people journey, and then migrant communities popping up and the Chinatowns that came out of that, like all of that. But it feels a lot like I'm circling being able to make work where I directly address myself. And there's a lot of holding myself rigorously to a standard of, is this true? You know, is this true? Am I being rigorous enough with myself and what I'm telling? When I do think of the audience, it's a little circuitous, but when I think of the audience and my responsibility to them, if there is one, it's of a caretaking role, which is if I'm having their time and their attention, I don't want to waste their time, I don't want to exploit their attention, and I want to either, like whatever that means, like I want to comfort them, I want to shock them into surprise, I want to surprise and delight them, but also that I'm going to be vulnerable and I'm going to tell you the truth. So, but to do that, I often have to not think of them at all. So, yeah.
So maybe more questions. You know, the second time that I hear you say that you're an angry writer, and then I think it's the first time I hear you say you're an angry writer, kind of, right? You say that, right? I didn't, okay. Yes, and then I'm always surprised because when I think of you, I never think of you of angry people. I always think of you so gracious and so polite and so sweet. And then, but yet, you know, now you said it a couple of times. I think about it. I see it. I see it. And when you see, you can only see, right? It's like, okay. So I just want to maybe say a follow-up question about this anger, because you know, I mean, when I put myself in your shoes, it's a lot, right? It's like you have to first, you know, make a space and be able to start sitting down and write, you know, like it's it's not easy, it's hard work, right? A lot of labor. But if it's time, as soon as you start writing, you have to think, oh, what my parents going to think, what this person going to think, and every step of the way, you're pushing back to make that space, that truth. But then when you start to think about audience, you know, and also even reviewers who's going to read your work and how they're going to interpret your work, you guys know. So what I hear is like some kind of, you know, ambivalence, right, in relations to your audience. So I want to ask you, you know, how is it, because I don't think too many people understand this, right? It's like, how is it, you know, to write to an audience you have ambivalence toward, and then you may not even trust like how they read what you're trying to tell them in a way that you think is obvious to you, but it may be totally appropriated a different way, or read or review or even analyze in a way that you don't intend and actually fight against. So I just want to say, and I want to ask you, so Matt, you know, is this ambivalence things, you see it as a American things, right? Or do you have that also, that ambivalence? Because, yeah, it seems like it's a lot to tackle. So is it located in your work, you know, in your writing, this ambivalence? Or drawing?
An ambivalence to the audience?
Yes.
I just think like I best serve them by like the work is like a rare space where I can speak in a voice and speak about things that I don't often do at parties or over dinner or with friends, you know? So it's like, it's a rare space where I can be like, hey man, look at this. And so, you know, like, I try and be as vulnerable and as exposed to them, not always, not like bleeding all over them, but, you know, like, I'm speaking, I guess, more about my personal work. I'm trying to be there with them, I'm trying to meet them, and I'm trying to surprise them a lot. So the reason I like doing all sorts of different work, whether it's like really, really commercial work and packaging, or books or editorial work, and you open your newspaper. Like I think about, like, you know, you're having your breakfast to get your newspaper delivered, and you're flicking it open, and you cross probably one of your op-eds or something, and there's an illustration, like what's the role there? You know, like how does it make your life better? And sometimes the role is just beautifying, you know, but sometimes the role is surprising you. So when I do an interactive website, interactive comic with a refugee story, or if I do an installation, or like whatever form it is, whatever form I take, the idea is that I'm entering spaces where you might not expect to see us and our stories. And that might be a commercial work, and you know, they hire me. My expertise in that case is I'm really cool at drawing, right? So I'll draw really well, and then they'll be like, oh, hey, that's pretty Asian. And it's too late by then, you know, like by then I've like entered a space where like they didn't see it, but I'm already there. So I think, yeah, like surprising and delighting I like surprising people, it's cool.
Thanks. I think Isabel and I have talked about this before, and I think most of the writers here may agree with the idea that, you know, there's writing and then there's publishing. So when you're writing, you should not really be thinking about anything but the text. And then when it's about to be published, while you're doing that last edit, all of those thoughts come in, you know. But it's not always so neatly bifurcated like that. And I'll just tell you, from my work, I know why, for the Book of Salt, I had a unreliable narrator, because it served, you know, it was kind of a, excuse my language again, but it was kind of a fuck you to the reader. You know, like if you really are coming to my work thinking that you're gonna find some sort of authenticity, some sort of, you know, sort of kind of sort of vessel of racial pain, you're going to encounter a narrator who's actually lying to you most of the time, and it serves him to tell you the things that he wants to tell you. And so it's my way of, you know, I think working through that ambivalence that you talk about. And just very briefly with the second book, it was really more about not a narrator who was necessarily lying, but she was keeping a lot of things from you, but selectively keeping it. She doesn't tell you the opposite of the thing that she's keeping. She just doesn't tell you, for example, what her ethnicity is. And her story is set in the American South. So if you, as the reader, assume that an American novel written, you know, and set in the South means, and if that person does not designate her race or ethnicity, if you assume that can only mean white or black, then you deserve the story that you are, like, you know, sort of misconstruing. So, you know, there are ways, I suppose, you know, that I continue and I try to do that. And it is, I've never, well, yeah, I suppose it's a way of dealing with the ambivalence that you have identified.
And can you imagine a world without ambivalence in your lifetime as a writer, and be free to write whatever the heck you want without having to fight those forces, without ambivalence?
Well, let me start off with a food example. I never wanted to be the writer who would write a sentence like, I went and had a bowl of pho, comma, a delicious beef noodle soup. Because automatically by doing that, you know I am not talking to Vietnamese people. Jonathan Franzen writes from the Midwest, And he would never write a sentence like, I went and had a sandwich, comma, 2 slices of bread with some delicious stuffing in between. He's going to write about whatever he wants to write about, and he will never translate, which is awesome. That's the way it's supposed to be. But that's majority privilege. And for me, my decision was that I would never renounce being a so-called minority, being Vietnamese, person of color, whatever. But I'm going to write about my so-called minority experiences as if I were the majority. Because I would not deny either one. And that's a literary question. As you were saying, you made a very good distinction, Monique, between the literary and the publishing thing. On the publishing side, it was hard because for much of my 20 years that I was trying to become a writer, I was very concerned about publishing. I was very concerned about agents and editors and was I going to get published and all that kind of stuff. And the breakthrough for me was what Vo said. I had to learn how to write for myself. And I think I've heard it from so many writers. This is the crucial breakthrough. You have to be able to write for yourself first and foremost. Then you can worry about audiences and all that other kind of stuff. But it's hard to access truth in art unless you're truthful with yourself and what you believe in. And when you say the fuck you to anybody else who has any stake in the publication of your work. So there are all these kinds of ambivalences that are in there, but I think most of us as writers and as artists have to come to that space where we don't have ambivalence about what it is that we believe in, and then we deal with the ambivalences of audiences that we can't control.
Do I have time for one more question, or very quickly? Okay, but this one is not the quick one. Okay. Well, I have to put it out there, bear with me. Please, it's okay, we stay a little bit longer. Right, it's important, right? We brought all those writers together. I cannot be like 2-minute things. No, I got angry. I rarely get angry, but I got angry a few months ago when I was, looking at Facebook, when in between writing, we do that. But I was looking at, like Monique's, on the Facebook page, and then we've, asked to write about, the war, right, and what's happening, and you wrote these beautiful essays, right, and about the hypocrisy of, people going to Mexican restaurants and then yet, wanting awards, right, but then you got response, then it was horrible, right, like because of race and gender, but you was like sexually harassed in a horrible way, I'm such a fan of yours, I was so angry for you, to somebody to talk to you like that. And, and so, and Viet responded, right, say, yeah, well, people call you name, but maybe sometimes they say, go back where you come from, kind of things, kind of names, but not in that very, like, I'm not going to repeat, right, but it was very horrendous, right? It was very sexual because being a woman. So I want to talk about, gender a little bit, and then the privilege. Maybe do you feel like you have a privilege as you guys as male, right, to have a forum to speak, and you feel safer? Maybe you can say something more. You have certain access because of gender, and then do you feel like your book is published in 11 languages and is, you get so many awards, but you feel like your gender and, not only race, but also, ethnicity, but the gender also impede, sometimes your ability to speak or have certain access to certain venue. So.
So just very quickly, the piece that Isabel is referring to was I wrote for The Salt, which is the NPR blog, food and food-related issues. And it was basically, like Isabel said, about, the irony that there are these, it was Kirsten Nielsen and Stephen Miller had, this was last year in June, they went to very upscale Mexican restaurants in DC and they got harassed and and there was this whole talk about civility and so my piece was very much citing the fact that that Mexican food is one of the most popular food in the United States, that I cited facts about how undocumented workers are basically in every single, essentially, kitchen, you know. So if you're not actually going to a Mexican restaurant, in essence, you are going to a Mexican restaurant, you know, because of the undocumented workers. And then also that the farm workers are primarily undocumented as well. So, but the thing is, I want you to know that that is the substance of the essay, because what I find, and I think many women who write opinion pieces here, is not, I disagree with you, I disagree with your ideas, and this is why. Instead, it's, you should be raped, you know, you're stupid, and that's basically it. Those are the two categories. Seriously, you know, and that's, there's no way, there's nothing to do with that, you know. So you can't even engage on the platform of opinions and facts because you're outside. You're just automatically, boom, you know, out.
Well, I think there is no doubt that that's true. I mean, all you have to do is go on Twitter and find out. Because I've noticed, for example, that, yeah, I get hate mail, but you're exactly right. The hate mail is generally intellectual or political. Even when they say, go back to where you come from, that's like a political, you know, disagreement, I guess. But the volume of what I get, the volume of criticism and the quality of criticism is nothing compared to what I can see happening on Twitter to you, but to numerous other, just Asian American women writers, for example. So there's no doubt that when, you know, the issues that you're bringing up are absolutely crucial. I mean, we can't just talk about race in isolation. We have to talk about it in combination with everything else that's happening at the same time. So, you know, the question of race or ethnicity or culture is just one venue. Now, here we're talking about being Vietnamese or Asian American, but once we get into other issues, you know, whether it happens to be gender or class or sexuality and so ideology and so on, things get very, very complicated, and we all, of course, have to acknowledge our different privileges in different situations.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Do we have time for Q&A for all the writers? No, okay. So please subscribe to Diacritics, go to DVAN Facebook page and donate, and thank you so much for being here and for the writers to be here. Have a good night. Oh, one more comments by Viet.
So we don't have time for a Q&A, but we do invite everybody to buy books, support Greenlight Bookstore and the authors will be back here, over there in the front to sign books, and you'll have your opportunity to go up and ask them questions then, okay? Thank you.